So there's a lot of layers to mine. But I think your Ilya Sorokin one is kind of a part of that. So I'm glad that's where we start. But I'm kind of going to do mine all in one.
Yes.
And essentially, I'm going to work it backwards because we can get into the details of like who plays worse. Like an Anders Lee continues to regress or Brocknell, like all that stuff would be a part of it. But I'm going to start with the end result. If the Islanders are a team that, the worst case scenario for me is if they're a team that just misses out on the playoffs, so like high 80s in points, low 90s in points, and on top of that, do not sell off Kyle Palmieri or Brock Nelson for anything. Yeah. So you are like, that is complete the worst case to be. Because if you keep those guys and you are like, hey, we're making a playoff push, and you make the playoffs, and then whatever happens from there happens, that's one thing. But if you, because like you could go, well, Lee regresses, Nelson begins to fall off, Palmieri's hurt, Pelican pull, like, and go through each thing, and then they bottom out and they're picking in the top 5 and have sold off Brock Nelson and Kyle Palmieri and maybe have an extra first round pick. That to me, that's not a worst case scenario. It stinks in the short term for this year, obviously. But what's even worse than that is the situation that I just laid out, where you don't finish as one of the 2 wild card spots. You finish in like wild card 3, the first team out of it. So you're picking like what, 15 at that point, 14, somewhere in that range. And Brock Nelson's leaving in free agency and Kyle Palmieri's leaving in free agency, and you don't get any sort of compensation back for them. Oh, and also guys like Anders Lee, who's on the cap for another year after this, isn't good anymore. Peugeot, same thing. Sorokin issues, and so on from there. But again, I know that it's kind of weird to work it backwards that way, but I think if whatever, we can get into the detail of like how they get to that point, but that spot is the absolute worst place they could be.
It really would, because the trade deadline, I just looked it up, is March 6th, 2025. We would have another 21 games to play in the schedule. So if we're close to being in a playoff situation, or maybe not actually in a wild card spot, we're only a few points out, mathematically still in it, baby, and then lose, like, you know what, I'm not selling my guys because we're still in it. We're in it to win it. Let's go. And then the chips don't fall as they may in our favor. We don't make the playoffs, and we're in some sort of mushy middle situation where we didn't add enough to acquire the pieces that we might need to acquire to accelerate that rebuild, or retool anyways going forward. And so we're stuck, and we're now stuck into, like, sure, we might have a 15th overall pick, as you said, but like, what friggin' good does that do? We have to retool, and we've got nothing to retool it with. Sure, a 15th overall can do one thing, but there's one thing. We don't have enough. We need more than one thing. If you're losing Brock Nelson, you're losing Kyle Palmieri. Like, you're needing, we already need a top line winger. You lose Kyle Palmieri, now you need two top six wingers and a second line center. Second, I'm out. Like,
good luck.
That's going next. Yeah, right. Like, free agency maybe, but like, how much? What is that cap space? That's $11 million in cap space in Brock Nelson, Kyle Palmieri gone. You're getting a hell of a steal in Brock Nelson at $6 million, scoring nearly 70 points and cementing that second line plus 30 goals. That's a steal of a deal right there. You're not going to get that going forward.
No.
And you're going to have to upgrade massively on Noah Dobson, right? Where we said $9 million, you're looking at a $5 million jump. Like that's basically, you lost anything for Kyle Palmieri. You just put that into Noah Dobson now. You have no money to go crazy in free agency to replace those guys. So yeah, I can see how that would be a worst case situation. You're not making the playoffs. You have nothing to retool going forward, and you lost two big pieces. Or you will probably, maybe you keep them. Actually, you know what? Maybe you keep them because you didn't trade them, but like, what are you keeping exactly?
Right. And then that's a whole different story on whether or not it's worthwhile to keep them, or like what you do. But again, that I could live with. I'm going to be disappointed, but I could live with, hey, they're sitting in 5th in the Metro. They're, 8 points back of a wild card spot, and they trade Brock Nelson and Kyle Palmieri, I'd say, okay, didn't have it this year. They're going to have 2 first-round picks. They might bottom out and finish like 6th in the division, something like that, 7th in the division, whatever. And then kind of like, let's retool this thing on the fly a little bit here. But it would just be so much worse if they're like, nope, we're good, we're going to stay pat. And then you finish like 88 points. And you're like, well, now what?
Shit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it gives you a sense of direction, at least next year, right? If you're trading off a Brock Nelson and a Kyle Palmieri, it sucks for sure. You don't want to have to trade them, but if you're in a situation where you probably should, you do that because you're bringing in the pieces to do something with later. The direction of the club's that we're going to take these pieces and we're going to use them to build up the club better next year. Not to say that these players that left weren't any good, but there's a clear sense of direction with what you're doing. Whereas if you stand pat, you're like, we've been doing this goddamn thing for 7 years now, or however long Lou Lamoriello has been here. It's felt like forever. We don't want to have to do it one more year. That's no longer direction because you're doing the same thing and expecting a different result. That's just not how this is supposed to work. We need a change in direction. So if he goes into next year, as you're saying, they're well out of the playoffs or at least out of it, and they don't do anything to show you a plan, yeah, I can see how that's a worst case scenario because you're going, we're doing the same goddamn thing again and it didn't work. What are we doing here? If you like that, make sure to subscribe to Up the Turnpike on Patreon for more exclusive New York Islanders content.